Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Today we are with Lucy Moore, who is a very well-known biographer. She wrote biographies of Nijinsky, Lord Hervey, a book on the Maharanis, and then also a book called Anything Goes. But today we're going to speak of a book that she introduces, she edited, called Christopher Gibbs, His World. It's an illustrated book with a lot of text that obviously Lucy Moore has edited. First of all, we would like to know, who was Christopher Gibbs?
Christopher Gibbs, he was many different people, really. He was known latterly in his life as a great antiques dealer, but also as a sort of decorator to the elite of the British. The man, some people call him the inventor of shabby chic. Some people say that he was the person who brought an haute sense of glamour to British interiors after the war. He was born in 1938 and he really was an antiques dealer from the very start of his career. Age 20, he started a shop with money lent to him by his mother. And as a child, he describes always picking up plates and looking at the other side of the plate and wanting to know where pictures came from and cutting down all his father's favourite shrubs and bringing them inside. So he was really a lover of beauty, but then he's celebrated also because he had lots of wonderful friends. You know, Mick Jagger said he was learning to be a gentleman from Christopher. He was around in the 60s with the Stones a lot. He took them to Morocco when they went there for the first time. So he also had a great deal of impact on British cultural life in terms of arranging huge donations to the National Gallery in London through his friend Paul Getty, who he advised, and also he advised the V&A and the National Gallery. Sorry, I've said the National Gallery, but also the National Trust on how to show their collections best.
Christopher Gibbs was coming from a family, I don't know if you call it a bourgeois family, good family, and he had several siblings and a twin sister. He went to Eton to be educated, where because I think of antique dealing, he had a problem immediately in Eton, right? Because
he did.
They say that he was dodgy, and after that he had to leave Eton and go to another school, right? What happened there?
He was asked to leave. I think what happened, and he sort of rather would brush it over when you talk to him about it, but I think what happened was he loved the antique shops on Eton High Street, and he used to go in there in and out, and he was great friends with the various owners of these antique shops. And one antiquarian bookshop, he went in, I think he bought a book thinking that it was more valuable than it was being sold for, and was then caught trying to sell it back to the person he'd bought it from. I think that's probably the most favourable interpretation of what happened. But he always said he learned his lesson after that and stuck to the straight and narrow from there on.
But was it a specific talent? Like someone is a painter or writer or singer, to be so interested in antiques, because his family was not like that. No, he was special.
No, he was special. His parents, who I never met, obviously. So my connection with Christopher is that my husband is his nephew. I see him also from the kind of family point of view, and they're very loving family, as you say, sort of upper middle class English family with this lovely tradition, quite old fashioned kind of country English family full of vicars and cricket players. And Christopher was not really he really was a scholar. He was, given that he really didn't have that much schooling, he was unbelievably knowledgeable. And what he loved were the stories about objects. And so, countless people have said to me, over the last few years as I've been doing this book, that they would, we've got this great friend who works for Christie's, who's a great friend of Christopher's, and Christopher was a sort of mentor to him. And he describes going to sales with Christopher, looking round, thinking, oh, there's nothing much here that I'm interested in. And then Christopher would say, have you seen this? And talk about something that looked quite ordinary. And within minutes, Orlando would say, I'm desperate to own it. And he would know, you could pick up a sort of practically a pebble on a beach and he'd be able to say, well, he wasn't a geologist actually, but he had that wonderful gift for seeing an object, knowing about the house that it had come from, maybe knowing about the family who'd commissioned it. So from that sense, as an antique dealer, it's a very handy skill because you see a portrait of Madame X and you know exactly who might want to buy it because you know that she married the first cousin of that person who lives in that specific house. So he was wonderful at those kind of connections. But
and
he
was probably the picture in your book where he's photographed with Bruce Chatwin, who he had as a guest in his apartment at the Albany. We'll talk later about it. I don't know who influenced the other. In other words, there are short stories like Mr. Todd by Chatwin or the book on porcelain.
Yes.
Therefore, who has influenced? Because it's the same idea of finding a special collector, a special item, Exactly.
I believe the porcelain one is a portrait of a specific dealer, but it's not Christopher as far as I know. Utz, isn't that right?
Utz, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But funny enough, I think they had quite a similar aesthetic in that they both rather loved grandeur, but they also loved things of humble provenance as well that were just beautiful to them. But I think that Bruce sounds like more of a nomad, the sort of person who just wanted to have a couple of things which he kind of kept, he was a sort of secret collector. Christopher describes going to see him and he would say, come and see my latest thing, and he'd unwrap it. And whereas for Christopher, I think it was much more about creating a space that was full of the things that gave him pleasure.
And going back to him, rather young when he is opening his first shop in Chelsea, he also comes from a traditional family. We see him pictured with his siblings and father with a tie and a suit and even later. But he instead changed also the way of dressing, right? Also his looks were at the time quite different.
Absolutely. He was one of those people who just set trends. So he had a couple of friends who were great figures in the 60s for the King's Road. I mean, Christopher, sometimes we called him the King of Chelsea, or he loved getting himself dressed in the 60s. I think at that particular stage in his life, and he would go at that stage, so much was for sale in England. I'm sure it was the same all over Europe as well. Post-war, these great houses had been abandoned. Often lots of them were being destroyed because people couldn't afford to keep them up. So there were lots of wonderful antiques to buy for someone like Christopher, but also there were, wardrobes full of amazing clothes. And so he would buy old bits of chintz and have them stitched in to make a lining for his coat. He was apparently the first man to wear flares. He was definitely one of the first men to have long hair at that time. And he went to Morocco as a young man, aged about 20, at the same time he opened his shop. And he would, wander around London in a caftan. People just hadn't seen that sort of thing before. My mother actually went to a convent school in England and remembers Christopher, who was a friend of her friend's sister, driving down in this sort of tiny little car stuffed full of people, all wearing marvelous velvet and sheepskin collars and smelling of patchouli as they, all unloaded from the car. And the nuns were inside, absolutely appalled.
These were the years of the swinging London and Chelsea. And at that time, he met probably Mick Jagger and Getty, who became his friends. And
exactly.
Who knows, maybe Anita Pallenberg or these people, right?
Absolutely. They were all his friends. I mean, it was a lifetime friendship with Paul Getty and with Talita Getty, his wife, but then who tragically died, but then also Victoria. In fact, I think it might have been Christopher who introduced Victoria to Paul. So Mick Jagger, the Stones, Anita Pallenberg, Cecil Beaton. He had a fling with Rudolf Nureyev. It was that sort of world where everybody, I think they were all young, they were all having a wonderful time, and they all sort of knew each other. And it was such a tiny little world.
But instead of writing a proper biography, this time you wrote a book who is an album of pictures representing the different moments of his life or his homes or his friends. But in the same time, Christopher used to write letters and articles. Many of his articles published in Vogue at the time.
Yeah.
Through these articles, you describe his life somehow, right? So you worked more as an editor or an interviewer somehow. I mean, you took answers or critics or feelings. You know, it's very interesting also his relationship with David Hicks, who at the time is a very famous decorator.
Yes.
And he doesn't criticize, but he doesn't feel like Hicks. I mean, he's something else, right?
Yes. Christopher was much sort of scruffier, I think, than Hicks. I think he enormously admired his work, but it wasn't for him. You know, I don't think he could have lived in that orderly way. You know, his mind was much more sort of encompassing all sorts of different things all at the same time. You know, he wasn't ever worried about things matching or there being a pattern to things. I was just going to go back to what you said about collecting his words. When he died, I just found all these articles, you know, old tear sheets and the proof pages from all these articles. The one on David Hicks, I don't think it was ever published. I think he was a little bit rude about him and the other decorators of the day, as you mentioned. And I'm not sure that Vogue actually published that one. I certainly haven't ever come across it in print. I only seen it in a draft. I realised that this life was there, and it'd be wonderful if someone else wanted to write a biography of him, a proper biography. But for this, I just very much wanted to collect what he'd written and to try and create a picture of a world, because it's so ephemeral, that sort of writing. It disappears in a flash.
You describe in the book chapters, right? From his youth to his beginnings, illustrated with photographs, obviously. Then there's a chapter called Gaining Confidence. In the first part, there is his apartment at the Albany, where he talks about it and what is the Albany. Not everybody knows it. But also, I think he has a big country house.
Yes.
And this is going up to the fifth chapter, Giving Back. Can you tell me a little bit of this? Because after all, his job, he had great friends, or he was a character, but he also worked, right? And therefore his own houses are the mirror of who he was.
Yes, very, very much so. I think part of the reason he was so admired as a decorator, although I don't think he would have thought of himself as a decorator really, was because he had this extraordinary personal charm, which was very much reflected in the places that he created. So his first flat he rented, it was in Cheyne Walk, so overlooking the river in London. And that's the house that I think they shot some of the party scenes of the film Performance in, with Mick Jagger and Anita Pallenberg. He was involved in that. And in fact, one little detail from Performance is Christopher wasn't in it, but they called the housekeeper in the film Mrs. Gibbs as an homage to him, because they'd shot so many, you know, he'd done all the scenery dressing for them. So he had that flat. Then he moved, I think, into Albany. That was his London life. He bought a priory in Kent.
I think they also shot, I don't know if it's in his house or Mick Jagger's house, the one you were talking about before.
Performance.
They also shot the Antonioni movie Blow Up.
Yes, I've heard that too.
Cheyne Walk, right?
Yeah. So he had these rather wonderful wild 60s, but he always was working. You know, he sold his first pieces to the Victoria and Albert Museum in the 60s, I think. And so he always was very much involved in that kind of sense of trying to preserve things for the nation and conserve these amazing houses. He was very much involved in this exhibition called The Destruction of the English Country House. He had a house called Davington Priory, which he bought and restored. And then when he was in his 40s, his parents died, and the house that he and his siblings had grown up in Oxfordshire was empty, and none of the other siblings wanted to live there. His elder brother was living in Australia with an Australian wife, another one was in Scotland. It came to Christopher. He said, I'd like to go and live there. So he then had about 20 years of very happily living in this wonderful childhood home that he'd grown up in, which was so attuned to his taste. You know,
he sold the other house.
He sold the other house, yeah. And with the Clifton Hampden, it was very much, he loved buying things that had been in it and had been sold and bringing them back. And he loved that 19th century aesthetic. His family were very keen. It was called the Tractarian movement in the 19th century. They helped found Keble College in Oxford. So it's a sort of very high church Anglicanism, almost Catholicism, but not quite. And it's very much like the Pugin-esque architecture, that sort of thing. And it was George Gilbert Scott who worked with Pugin, who designed Clifton Hampden. So it's a world an aesthetic that he really loved. And he was there until 2000 when he sold it and moved permanently to Tangier.
And he kept the apartment in the Albany, right?
Yes, he had what they call a peppercorn rent. It's owned by an Oxford college, I think it was. And so he had one of those long leases, very luckily.
Even when he moves to Morocco, and we'll talk about it, he keeps a foot in London. He never closes his relationship with his country, right?
Oh, absolutely.
He was coming regularly. Why? Because he was still buying things or dealing, or it was just
definitely
friends?
Buying things and dealing until he was probably 70, and still coming back to London for work things. And also he was very much involved in Getty's charitable trusts, and so he was coming back for those sort of meetings and things, giving money, as he said, to unpopular causes. I think he rather saw it as having a social life in England, and Morocco was where he went to retreat. And of course, as it turns out, Tangier has become fantastically sociable, and he had to pretend that he didn't like going out at all in order to get peace and quiet. But at the time, I think he saw it at the Moroccan side of his life as one of retreat and a place to read and be in the garden and have a more peaceful life. And then the contrast was with London.
Yeah, but he was going to Morocco since he was very young.
Yeah.
He went to Tangiers also when Tangiers was rather out of fashion.
Yeah.
But he only bought the house of Mrs. McBay, the wife of the painter.
Yes, absolutely.
Later. I mean, he never had a house before.
He used to rent houses he rented various places. And I think by the time he decided that he wanted to settle there, I think he was called Richard Timewell. Does that mean something to you? I think he'd worked for Christie's or Sotheby's, and he had a wonderful house in town in Tangier, which Christopher had bought in order to live in, I think. And then he and Marguerite discussed before she died that he would buy the house from her executors. So I think probably for 5 years from his mid-60s, he was thinking about having somewhere more permanent and being in Morocco all the time.
Why he decided to live in Morocco?
The cynic in me says that he liked the fact that it was a bit more old-fashioned. In a sense, he could be like an 18th century gentleman and say, oh, please, can you knock that wall down there? And you could live like that because things were cheaper to live for him. You could have that sort of grandeur of nice people looking after you and all that kind of thing. I think he liked that side of it. And I think he found it very congenial. I mean, Tangier with its English church, which he loved and was a warden of for many, many years. He loved that mixture of louche William Burroughs type people and the old English ladies who'd landed up there who he'd take to church every Sunday.
Was he religious?
Yes, very much so. When he died, they had a funeral in Tangier. His wonderful friend, his Moroccan taxi driver, who'd always driven him around, did the Arabic prayers for the dead over the coffin, and then they walked the coffin down the old mountain and before it got taken off to the church, and all the African members of the congregation sang When the Saints Go Marching In as they buried the coffin. Then he had a big memorial service in London, in the church near Albany, which he'd loved. And then he also had another one in Clifton Hampden, so he'd planned it all out.
Where is he buried?
He is buried in Tangier. He wanted to die in Tangier. because when he was dying, he was in London, and then suddenly we realized that he was dying, and there was this huge effort because he wanted to get back to Tangier.
So at the end, he was very attached to Tangier. Like he had friends there, and
Yeah, lots of friends.
at that time, can you describe a little bit? He bought the house of Marguerite McBay, but in the same time, he built some other houses or something, and then he was very keen on his garden, right? He gave a lot of importance to his garden and his gardening.
Yes, absolutely. Well, he would be the first to say that he loved gardens, but wasn't much good at getting his hands dirty, but he loved plants, and always it was really important to him. The garden was very much a part and parcel with the house. You couldn't conceive of a house without its garden, I think, to him. So he bought the house from Marguerite, and almost immediately a little bit of neighbouring land became available, which had a ruined chapel on it. And he made that into, over a period of several years, working with Cosimo Sesti. There's put a swimming pool, and there's made this little chapel into a sort of bachelor house, with a library. It's the most lovely place. And then the main house of the Bays is a sort of central, he would send his people to stay there. He would stay up in the chapel. His friend Peter had a house in the garden, has still a house in the garden. And so the two of them would then meet for their meals in the main house.
And he was also close to an Italian gardener.
Yes, very close to Umberto Pasti. Yes.
Umberto helped him somehow for his garden. No?
Yes, I think so. I think they shared an interest in native Moroccan plants. I mean, Umberto, I think, knows more about Moroccan flora than anybody. I think that was absolutely a shared passion for both of them. And I think Umberto introduced him to a botanist who he worked with sometimes, but that was absolutely one of their shared interests. And he was very close to Umberto in those years.
At the end of the day, what did he do with his furniture, with all these beautiful objects?
It's all there still. It's the same.
He sold them.
Oh, you mean in England? Yeah, he had a huge sale when he left England.
Christie's, right?
Yeah.
With the red book.
With the red book, yeah. He had that huge sale, which sounded amazing. And he just brought his favourite things out to Tangier and moved them in there, and they're all still there, really, the things that remained. His library and all of that sort of stuff is still there.
It's not much a question of paintings in his life, right?
Yes and no. I think, funny enough, you're right. It was more the story of a painting. I mean, he did, but it's the story of it that he loved. So there's a huge picture of Hercules wrestling Antaeus above in one of the rooms. And he loved that because he lived on the Straits of Gibraltar by the Pillars of Hercules. And so he loved the fact that he had this wonderful picture of Hercules on the Pillars of Hercules. And he also loved the fact aesthetically that it was a marvelous, muscular, naked man wrestling. So it sort of ticked a lot of boxes. One of the great triumphs of his working life was discovering an unattributed Holbein tondo of Thomas Wyatt the Younger. So he definitely had an eye for paintings, but the house is not full of paintings for their own sake. They are more things that have a connection to Tangier. He loved all those Wenceslas Holler engravings of Tangier, collected those. He loved Sir John Lavery's pictures because they were of the hill that he lived on. It was the story and the connection that really got him excited, I think.
You said that he was critical with some decorators of his time, or was he close to David Milanarik?
Very.
Famous decorator of the time.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Very much so. They worked together a lot. They worked helping to restore Spencer House. They both worked together for the National Trust. They worked together with the big British galleries in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And they were great, great friends as well as colleagues. They'd known each other since those days. In fact, David's wife, Martha, worked for Christopher in his shop before she married David in the mid-60s. So they were completely sort of intertwined, as was Cosimo Sesti's parents, who were old friends of theirs, with the Ormsby Gores. And they had this lovely web of friends who all had similar interests. And I don't know if you know the Sestis, but the sort of biodynamic wine and everything and the restoration of their place in Tuscany, it's also very much what Christopher was up to as well.
Besides London and Tangiers, Morocco in general, did he travel a lot or not so much?
No.
Talk about India, you never talk about America.
He never went to India.
Or many other cities. I mean, there is something on Paris, but very little.
Yeah, he went to Paris as a student. I'm not even sure he ever went to America, because I thought that he had met Robert Mapplethorpe in America, but actually he met Mapplethorpe in London. I really think he went to Tangier, he went to Morocco and decided that was the place for him. He never went to India, unlike so many of his contemporaries. I never heard him talk about New York. He went to Australia to see my husband's family. They were all growing up out there. And he liked to go on holiday and everything. You know, if somebody asked him to a Greek island or something, he'd go. But it was really, Morocco was his place. I think it really spoke to him. It answered something that he was seeking.
Was a family man? I mean, was he close to his family?
Yeah, very much so.
Twin sister?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. It's a very big, loving family, and they were all very close. Yeah.
You met him, obviously, you knew him. What kind of person was he?
He just was so full of charm. When I first met him, my husband took me to stay with him, and he had a little cottage in Clifton Hampden. And it was the time when the snowdrops were out. He loved the snowdrops. So it was a really good time to go and see him, because he took us round to show us all these special secret places that he knew where the snowdrops were, the good snowdrops. And that was really fun. But when I arrived, I'd just written my book about Lord Hervey, and he said, "Oh, you're a historian. What do you write about?" And I said, "Oh, well, perhaps you know about Lord Hervey, who's quite an obscure person in English history. You know, he was an advisor to Robert Walpole, but he's not a very prominent person except for having written these memoirs." Christopher said, "Oh, of course I know Lord Hervey. Not only that, look at this cup and saucer. I've just bought the china that came from the house of his lover, Stephen Fox." So, you know, he just knew something about everything. The big picture of Hercules and Antaeus in Tangier, the frame was a frame on the sister-in-law of the person somebody else I wrote about. So he was incredibly scholarly on those things. He knew about everything. So I loved that side of him. But he also was just very warm. He could be a little bit waspish, as you can see in some of the articles. But he was just a kind, very charismatic person, you know, who was a delight to be around.
He was also having something to do with the king, right? With King Charles.
Yes, he became friends with King Charles through Candida Lysick Green, John Betjeman's daughter. I mean, as far as I know, they were very fond of each other. It was a lasting friendship for both of them, and Christopher felt very close to him, I know.
So he remained a British man, like in the tradition he went to live abroad, right? Very typical of a certain kind of...
Yes.
Was living like before the war, in a way. You know?
Yes.
What is strange is that he had this very conservative way of living and liked old objects and antiques and things. But in the same time, he has been someone who has revolutionized fashion in his young age.
Absolutely.
I don't say he was a rebel, but he was certainly very eccentric at the time, right?
Yes, I think so. And also he was gay, and he was, you know, very much, that was something that he was always very comfortable with. You know, he'd spoken to his parents about it. It was very much accepted. Actually, there were 5 brothers, and of the 5 brothers, 2 were gay. Nobody thought anything of it. And that was at a time when it was illegal. You know, it was against the law to be a practicing homosexual, as they would have said. So I think he was quite a revolutionary in that sense. He was very relaxed about things like drugs and that sort of stuff in the 60s. I mean, he obviously wasn't carrying on taking lots of drugs into his later life, but he campaigned for drugs to be decriminalized. So in many ways, he was quite a forward-thinking person, although, as you say, he did like to live himself in this rather old-fashioned way.
And why did you decide to dedicate your work to him? Why did you want to put together a book?
I wanted very much to establish something which would be a permanent memorial of him, and it was a complete labour of love. I absolutely adored him. You know, we're so lucky to have had him in our lives, and I really wanted to do something that would preserve his legacy for future generations so that in 250 years, somebody will be able to pick it up and know that he existed. And there wasn't really anything because the houses will be dispersed, the gardens will be gone. He's a very important figure. He's a Horace Walpole or a William Beckford or, one of those people. It's the sort of gentleman-aesthete is a great English tradition. And he was very much part of that. And I wanted to sort of put a stick in the ground to say he was here and this is what he did. And that was my motivation.
If you want to resume, what did he do? He, around himself, created a style, a lifestyle, a home style, way of living style.
Yes, I think it's really about...
Only, as you said at the beginning, he's not only a very famous antique dealer or an estate or a gardener. Altogether, how would you define this person, his legacy? Because he's very well known.
Yes.
He's not a star, he's not Mick Jagger.
Yes.
But he's not only a friend of the stars.
Yes, no, people wanted to be his friend rather than the other way around.
Right.
I think that's part of what it was. It was the really, the houses and the gardens were very much an expression of his personality, which was so attractive. The way he looked in the 60s, but also the way he looked in his 60s and 70s. He was just a marvelously attractive person. And that thing of having a story about something and being comfortable. He was comfortable with the grandest things, but also the humblest things. And I think that's very modern and important. But what he loved was people who were what he described as being true to themselves, who weren't mucked around with. And houses were the same, I think, for him. He couldn't bear the idea that you might go to buy a flat pack chest of drawers when you could buy yourself probably for the same money, a beautiful old chest of drawers that somebody else had used before you. And he loved that sense of provenance.
He didn't like the modern.
I don't think it was that he didn't like the modern, but he didn't like the ordinary.
Was he interested in the contemporary, in the modern? Nowadays, there's a lot of talking about design and all that. Was he interested in that or not?
I don't think so, really. The modern or the artists of his time that he was interested in were his friends. So Patrick Proctor or David Hockney or those kind of figures were people in his part of his world. So he liked their work because of that. And he liked, again, always things with history. So there's or with kind of provenance that were connected. He loved all the McBay pictures, but that was because they came from the house that he loved.
So his life is a biography, his work is a biography, but you cannot say about him like you would say about Jean-Michel Franck or like Madeleine Castin. There's not a Gibbs style.
No. I don't think so, because the decorating he did, for want of a better word, was because people said to him, oh, can you just do for me what you do for yourself? And so it was all about having interesting things and making them look lovely. And he loved the bones of a house. But he doesn't have a Franck or Casting. It wasn't commercial enough, really. He did it occasionally for friends, but he wasn't a decorator who tried to have a look and was conscious of that, really. For him, it was very much about the objects, the pictures, the furniture, that taken all together, what he would have said is to create a sense of that person. And it created a sense of him in his houses. And I suppose he helped his friends do that in their house. I don't know what kind of house. I think he did up houses for Mick Jagger. I can only imagine they look like Mick Jagger, but I don't know.
The family has kept his last house in Tangier.
Yes.
And you sometimes go there?
Absolutely. It's a most magical place, and it feels as if Christopher has just gone off for a swim or, gone down to buy something in the market. It feels very much still full of him, very resonant of him.
There is a lot of love in your words and also in your book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Alain Elkann interviews.